and welcome to Sipz and Stories. My name is Elizabeth, and in today's video I will be doing a recap of my favorite books of 2022. As you can expect, most of these books are classics with one exception. I don't apologize for loving classics, I just do. In fact, when the Goodreads list came out this year, I barely recognized any of the books on that list. So one of my goals for the future in 2023 is to read more modern books, but this year it just happened to be all classics. So grab your favorite beverage as I discuss my favorite books from 2022. The first book on this list should come as no surprise, and that is Greyfriars Bobby by Eleanor Atkinson. If you remember my Edinburgh bookshop video, I talked about this book, and it really does represent Edinburgh to me. I had such a great time on that trip, and I read this book while I was there, and it just gave me the spirit of Edinburgh, and it made me love the city that much more. If you're unfamiliar with this story, it is about a little dog named Bobby who, when he is a puppy, his owner, Jock, sadly dies. And during the funeral, Bobby sneaks into the graveyard and he refuses to leave the gravesite where old Jock is buried. So as creepy as that is, the whole town just kind of accepts that Bobby is a part of this graveyard, Greyfriars Kirkyard, and they let him stay there for the next 14 years, and he just really ingratiates himself with the entire community. All the children come to visit him, rich and poor people, politicians, merchants, just the whole city adopts this little dog, and it's such a heartwarming tale. It is also loosely based on the real dog Greyfriars Bobby, so when you do visit the Kirkyard, you will see the statue of Bobby, you will see where he is buried, and he is just really a staple in Edinburgh. I love this book so much, and even though it was written by an American, I just think it is one of the best children's books out there, especially if you love animals and dogs in particular. Love this book, and it is my top 10 pick of 2022. At number 9 is Leave It to P. Smith, or the P is silent, so Leave It to Smith by P.G. Wodehouse. This is a folio edition that I recently purchased and I really love it. The title is there on the spine. I will show you some close-up shots because I love folios, and the pen and ink illustrations in this one are really special and they just kind of bring the book to life, especially with Smith's monocle and things like that. Love the illustrations. But I was a little nervous at first to read something by P.G. Wodehouse that was not Jeeves and Wooster. I love Bertie Wooster. He's one of my favorite characters in literature, so to not read a book that is set in his voice was a little scary for me. But I should not have worried because now I know that anything P.G. Wodehouse has ever written is comedic genius. I could read his grocery lists now. He is just that good of a writer. In fact, he is my all-time favorite writer just because he can change my mood and lift my spirits instantly. And no other author that I've ever read can do that for me except P.G. Wodehouse. So if you're having a bad day or you got in a fight with someone or your life just feels bad, I do recommend reading P.G. Wodehouse. He will instantly lift your mood. He'll make you see the funny side of life. He'll make you see the funny side of the people in your life. And he'll just kind of just change your outlook. It's like you're wearing P.G. Wodehouse glasses. But I really like this one. The story of Smith is hilarious. I'm not going to describe the plot because, as you know, Wodehouse is not really great with the plots. It's more his language. It's more his use of humor and his witty sense of humor. But this one is about Smith, a man about town, who he kind of gets himself invited to Blanding's castle because he wants to be near this girl that he has a crush on. So it's just such a cute little story. And then it does loosely link to the Blandings novels, which I have not read yet either, but I really want to. Love this one, and yeah, if you've read it, you know that there is some significance to that red umbrella. Love this one. At number 8 is Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. Anne Bronte is fast becoming my favorite Bronte sister now, and I read her book Tenant of Walthall Hall last year, which is one of my favorite books of 2021. So I'm so happy that she's back on the list for my favorite books of 2022. Was Agnes Grey as good as Tenant of Walthall Hall? Probably not. That book is a little more feminist, a little more deep, a little more dramatic, but this one is so good. A lot of critics think that this is the most autobiographical of all the Bronte novels. I would also add that it's the easiest of all the Bronte novels. It feels like the most YA of all the Bronte novels. In fact, Faber, who published this edition, they published it as a part of their YA Classics series. It's not abridged at all, it's unabridged, but I never thought about the Brontes in that way before until Faber called this a YA book. Yes, the Brontes are really good YA writers. All their stories are great coming-of-age stories. Agnes Grey is fantastic. It does describe probably Anne Bronte's life of being a clergyman's daughter. The family falls on hard times, and so Agnes Grey decides to contract herself out as a governess. She ends up working for all these really selfish and cruel families and kind of becomes disillusioned by the aristocracy and these wealthy people. I loved it because I used to be a teacher, so I think if you are a teacher, you will love this book because the parents, the teachers, the children, kids, nothing has changed with that dynamic in the last 150 years. The parents still think their kids are perfect little angels when they're not. But that being said, even though this book is funny and it has kind of a cynical sense of humor, it also has a really heartwarming romance as well. I really love the character of Mr. Weston and his relationship with Agnes Grey. It's just a really sweet little love story. So yeah, if you want to break into the Brontes, I think this book is a nice place to start. I really, really loved it. At number 7 is Dangerous Ages by Rose McClay. This is a part of the British Library Women's Writers series that I have not been able to shut up about in the last few videos of mine since I got back from England. I love this series. It's not available in the US, which is a shame. It's only really available in the UK. It features all of these great books about strong female characters that were written by some really fantastic female authors during the turn of the century. So anywhere from the 1900s to like maybe the 1950s, 1960s. All the books that I've read in the series so far are fantastic. I want to collect them all. They usually are about women my age that are kind of in between that stage of not being young but not being old and just kind of still trying to figure things out. Maybe that's why they speak to me. But I really like this one the most so far of what I've read, and that is Dangerous Ages by Rose McClay. This book is fantastic. It is so modern for a book that was written 100 years ago. It tells the story of 4 women in this family, everyone from the matriarch, Mrs. Hillary, who's in her 60s. She has raised her kids. Her husband has passed away. She's just trying to figure out who she is in her 60s. She ends up going to a psychologist and learning about psychology. Really cool. It also talks about Mrs. Hillary's 2 daughters, Neville. Neville is in her 40s. She has this really glamorous family. Her husband's in politics, the quote-unquote perfect life, but she's dissatisfied and she kind of wants to go back to her true love, which is medicine. So she goes back to school to be a doctor. Again, really groundbreaking for a book written 100 years ago. And then I would say the main character in this book is Mrs. Hillary's second daughter, Nan. Nan is in her early 30s and she's this woman about town. She has this very glamorous life, a lot of friends, a lot of boyfriends, and she is a writer. And she kind of needs to decide whether she wants to continue to be an independent woman or whether she wants to settle down and raise a family. And then the last character in this book is Greta. Greta is actually Neville's 20-year-old daughter, and she just really represents the 20s perfectly because she's really opinionated but really naive at the same time. So although Greta is kind of the villain of this book, I really liked her. And she's the villain because she steals Nan's boyfriend. So again, I love this book. I cannot recommend it highly enough. One of my favorites of the year. At number 6 is The Never-Ending Story by Michael Ende. And this book has been on my TBR for a long time until I picked up this new edition this year. I love the physical edition of Never-Ending Story, and here's why. Because the text is written in 2 colors. It's so neat. So that's kind of half the reason I love this book, because as a book collector, I just think the aesthetics of this book are so interesting, how it is printed in 2 different colored inks. So if you're unfamiliar with the story, the reason they did that is because it's about a little boy who goes from his world into the world of Fantastica, the book that he's reading, the never-ending story. So when Bastien is in his real world, the text is in green, and then when he goes into Fantastica, the text changes to kind of this like mauve-ish, purple, red color. I love that about this book. I think it's reason enough to read the book. I just think that's an interesting feature that I wish more authors, more publishers would experiment with. But again, this is such a good story. I think a lot of people my age are probably familiar with the movie that was set during the 1980s, right? It's a very trippy movie. My brother loved it when we were kids. I hated it when we were kids because it used to scare the pants off of me. But now that I've read the book, I kind of understand the movie a lot more. Some of the things that scared me, for instance, in the movie, learning the backstory of these characters and these situations and these different worlds throughout Fantastica really made me appreciate the movie that much more. But yeah, the book is completely different. I also like the character of Bastien in the book a little more. He is more fledged out, his character. His relationship with his father is really important to the plot of the book. So yeah, when he goes into the story, every reader has wanted to do that at some point, of literally go into the story, become the protagonist of the book you are reading. Love this so much. Another reason I really love The Neverending Story is it's very spiritual in nature. It's very metaphysical. So I tend to view like the child empress as almost like a god figure. Very similar to how Aslan is supposed to represent Jesus and Christ in the Chronicles of Narnia. I think a lot of that is happening in The Neverending Story as well. It's just coming at it from a more spiritual perspective. Very deep, very impactful. In fact, I love the whole symbol of like the snake eating its tail or eating itself. I think that is like a really major symbol in Eastern religions and spirituality. So again, this one is really, really deep. There's a lot going on in this story than just the story itself. I love this one. One of my favorites of 2022. At number 5 is Room with a View by E.M. Forster. E.M. Forster is probably one of my all-time favorite classic writers. In fact, his book Howard's End is one of my all-time favorite classic books. So if you're looking for a really good book to read in the new year, I do recommend Howard's End. It's a lot better than this book, but I've always wanted to read Room with a View, but I've been waiting till I went to Italy. So I finally got back from Italy this year, finally saw Florence, and I'm so happy that I waited, because had I read this book before going to Florence, I wouldn't have understood half of it. Where I think when you're in Italy and you are a tourist in a foreign country, you will just really pick up on a lot of the jokes and the innuendos in this book. At the end of the day, it's just a really sweet love story with Lucy Honeychurch and George Emerson, and they come from two separate worlds and they fall in love with each other. It does speak to E.M. Forster's own personal life. He was a closeted gay man, so I do think he put a lot of these LGBTQ themes in his novels, which makes them a lot more interesting to read from our modern perspective. But I'd say my favorite part of this book is he talks about like what it feels like to be a tourist. Especially what it feels like to be a tourist, not only when you're in the place that you're visiting, but when you get back, as I have, and you just kind of don't fit back into your old life. You don't know what to do with yourself. You had a really great time, and then you're like, now what do I do? I think Lucy Honeychurch goes through a lot of those feelings. I can definitely relate. One of the other things that I really love about E.M. Forster's books is that his characters are very multifaceted. Not everyone is good, not everyone is bad. In fact, there were times when I was really exasperated with Lucy. I thought she could be really mean at times. And there were other characters that were supposed to be bad, like Charlotte and Cecil, who I ended up really liking. They ended up doing the right thing in the end. So yeah, I think that's why E.M. Forster is such a great author, is because he lets the reader form their own opinion about the storyline, about the characters. He's a fantastic writer, and as a lot of people say, A Room with a View is E.M. Forster on a good day. Speaking of travel, my number 4 pick for 2022 is Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck. This, of course, is a folio edition, one of my prized folios, one of my favorites in the collection. I will show you some close-up shots. But John Steinbeck is one of those authors I have mixed feelings about, probably because he's written one of my favorite books of all time, East of Eden, and one of my least favorite books of all time, Grapes of Wrath. So I'm always fascinated by John Steinbeck, but I really do like Steinbeck at the end of the day. He's just a great storyteller. He just cannot help himself. And this book is all about a road trip that he takes across America with his dog Charlie in his camper. And it's so good, but a lot of critics do say that about 20–30% of this book is probably not true. That it's just John Steinbeck being John Steinbeck and telling these tall tales based loosely on some of the experiences that he had. I cannot fault him for that because he's such a terrific writer. So just keep that in mind, as you should with any autobiography, is that half of these stories are probably not true. But he's such an entertaining writer, which is why I love this book. But he did take this trip with his dog, and he did go from New England across America to Chicago to my neck of the woods in Washington. He goes into Texas, and then he ends the book in the Deep South in the 1960s. It's really interesting, the politics in this book, as he travels around, you know, talking about the election between Kennedy and Nixon, seeing what's going on in the South, the segregation, the racism, the kids just going to school and all the mothers are screaming and yelling. He goes down there, he witnesses it, or does he? But really good reading this, you know, 60 years later, and just seeing that, thank goodness some things have changed in America, but a lot of things have not, sadly. So really enjoyed this. I think it would make an interesting read, especially at this time. So really like Steinbeck, and this book, Travels with Charlie, is really good. At number 3 is Mayor of Casterbridge. Again, I'm sorry for this very vintage edition, which I picked up at McNaughton's bookshop in Edinburgh. So I will link my Edinburgh video below again. But I am so happy that the girls picked this for Victober as their group pick, because otherwise I probably would not have read this book, and it was fantastic. I now really, really love Thomas Hardy. I want to read all of his books. He just does a lot of things really well. He's a good nature writer. So when he sets all these books in Wessex, in this like fictional county in England, he describes the landscape and the farms, and he really just makes you feel like you're in this town, like you're there with these people. He's also a really great writer of characters. All of his characters are fantastic, and just like Ian Forster, all of his characters are very multidimensional. They are neither good nor bad. They're neither heroes nor villains, but some sort of combination of both, just like real life people. And then he just has really great observations of people and human nature. So his writing and his observations, and then how he opens every chapter, just really, really good. It's at a very high level. This book is also very dramatic, which is another thing he does very well. A lot of it is like watching a soap opera. So every few chapters you're like, oh my God, dun, 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 that happened. Oh my goodness. I didn't know, where did that person come from? Where did that character come from? What, you mean he knew her? What? So it's just really good. I loved it. So what is the story about? It's basically about a man named Michael Henchard, and he is the mayor of Casterbridge. No spoilers there. But it starts off when he's in his early 20s, and he's roaring drunk at this fair one day. His wife's with him, his young child. He gets so drunk that he sells his wife to this sailor. And so that's the beginning of the book. That's what hooked me. It's like, oh my goodness, I can't believe he just sold his wife and his child to this stranger. So the story fast forwards 20 years into the future. Michael becomes this very wealthy man in this small farming town of Casterbridge. He becomes the mayor. He's very respected in the community. And then some business rivals enter the scene, and then his wife and his daughter also come back on the scene. And it's just interesting to see like how that develops. Really loved his character. I really loved Elizabeth too in this book. I really just thought Elizabeth was trying, and then just their relationship between Michael and Elizabeth in this book, so good. But Michael's story is fascinating, even though he's not a really likable character because he once did this really horrible thing. It's just really interesting, you know, his rise, his fall, and then just everything in between. It's a lot about forgiveness. It's a lot about learning to appreciate the people that are in your life and not hurting the people in your life, because it's going to have repercussions down the road. So love this one. Yes, one of my favorites of 2022. My second pick of 2022 was The Mitford Sisters, or The Sisters, The Saga of the Mitford Family by Mary S. Lavelle. I read The Pursuit of Love this year by Nancy Mitford, and I just ended up becoming fascinated with the Mitfords, this whole aristocratic family in England during the early 20th century. The story of the sisters is like a history of the early 20th century. So I really want Julian Fellowes to get together with the writers who produced The Crown and create this new television show based on the Mitfords. I am certain it would be a hit. If you like Downton Abbey, if you like The Crown, if you like drama, intrigue, strong female characters, you will love these sisters just as much as I do. And one reason I think a lot of writers, directors, creatives have probably steered clear of the Mitford sisters is because they were very political. So several of the sisters were socialist communists, my favorite, Jessica, and then several of them were fascists. In fact, two of the sisters were in the inner circle of Hitler, Unity and Diana. But at the same time, their cousin was Winston Churchill. So again, a fascinating history of their life, of the politics in Europe at that time. And just, yeah, I love this so much. And of course, my favorite Mitford sister is Nancy, of course. She was the writer, she was the intellectual, she's the one that had all these friends, famous friends. And then Diana was like the socialite that she obviously based all of her books on. But yeah, just fascinating women, fascinating characters, even though their lives were so tragic. Again, my favorite would probably be Jessica, simply because she was the most interested in civil rights and politics. She ended up living in San Francisco. She was good friends with Maya Angelou. So again, I do not know why they have not made a quality documentary, a quality television show about these women. So when I was in London, I am so fascinated with Nancy Mitford that I had to track down this bookshop where she worked at. It's called Haywood Hill Bookshop. It's in Mayfair. It's really easy to find, especially if you're in the area near Buckingham Palace. It's just literally across the park. It's right there. And the booksellers there could not have been any friendlier. Once they knew that I was fascinated with Nancy Mitford, they were just telling me all these funny stories about her, about when she worked at the bookshop. They did recommend this book by India Knight called Darling, which was just published this year. It's supposed to be a remake of The Pursuit of Love, or based on The Pursuit of Love. And Zoe at the bookshop, she was such a great bookseller, and she was just telling me all these funny stories about how Nancy would show up late all the time, how she kind of turned Haywood Hill into almost this like Shakespearean company of London with all of her literary friends. And then she said that she would just kind of go off and leave the shop and not close the shop or lock it, and just leave the cash there and just kind of go off with her friends if they were going to a party or something. So it's a really special historical place. I do recommend that if you're in the area to visit that bookshop, Haywood Hill. Love the booksellers there, and I can't wait to read this book, Darling, in the new year. Okay, last but certainly not least, and that is my #1 pick of 2022, would be Goodbye, Mr. Chips by James Hilton. So I had no intention of reading this book, but then when I got home, I went to this really charming bookstore in Snohomish, Washington, and it looks like this little log cabin. And the bookseller there is so kind, so friendly, and she had a great selection of children's vintage books and books like this in the Junior Deluxe edition. So I spent a good chunk of change in that bookstore. And when I got home, I just started reading Goodbye, Mr. Chips on a whim. I read it in one sitting. It's so easy to read. It's only about 100 pages, 120 pages. But this story just blew me away, and James Hilton's writing in particular also blew me away. So for a story that can be kind of sappy and very heartwarming, he just tells it in this very refreshing way. I love his voice in this, which is just half the charm of this book. So again, what is Mr. Chips about? Mr. Chips is very similar to, I would say, It's a Wonderful Life. So it's perfect for this time of year. just like It's a Wonderful Life, it will really help you assess your goals, your values in life. And it is about this teacher named Mr. Chipping, or Mr. Chips for short, as the boys call him. And he works as a teacher in this all-boys boarding school in England. So the book starts off when he's in his 20s and he first becomes a teacher. And he has all these like reservations about being a teacher. He doesn't know how to discipline the kids. And then it goes throughout his life, in his 40s when he meets his wife, and then all the way till when he's in his 90s and he's retired. It's such a sweet book, so heartfelt, and again, it just really teaches you that to lead a good life is not about money, it's not about power, fame, it's about being a part of a community and contributing to a community and working with people. And I think that's something we all forget, especially in the new year. But if you're reassessing your goals, this is a good book to read before you start 2023. Love this book. It was my favorite book of the year. Thank you everyone for joining me for my 2022 wrap up. These were my top 10 favorite books of the year. Yes, most of them were classics, and I do promise in the new year to read more modern books by modern authors, like Darling by India Knight, especially because it was based on Pursuit of Love. But what can I say? I like classics, and all of these books are fantastic, so heartwarming. They're classics for a reason, and I hope you pick one of them for your 2023 TBR. Thanks everyone, have a great day.